great voice of reason in the wilderness, Dr. Salim Mansur, and I'm very excited and happy to be the one introducing him. Dr. Salim Mansur is a professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario. He's the author of The Quran Problem and Islamism from 2017, and also Delectable Lie, a liberal repudiation of multiculturalism, released in 2011, which has been published widely in academic journals. Mansur wrote a weekly syndicated column for the Toronto Sun for over a decade, and a monthly column for the magazine Western Standard. He periodically wrote for the National Post, has been published in many other well-known journals and online outlets, in addition to being a frequent analyst and commentator on radio and television. Having moved to Canada from Calcutta, India, Mansur completed his studies and graduated with a doctorate in political science from the University of Toronto. He worked as a research fellow at the Canadian Institute for International Peace and Security before joining the University of Western Ontario. Mansur is a senior distinguished fellow with the Gatestone Institute in New York, member of the board of directors of Center for Islamic Pluralism in Washington, D.C., and an academic consultant with the Center for Security Policy, also based in Washington, D.C. Mansur was presented with the Canadian Values Award for Peace, Order, and Good Government in 2015, and with the Canadian Senate's Sesquicentennial, this is a very difficult word, medal in recognition of valuable service to the nation in 2017. He was also awarded the American Jewish Congress Stephen S. Wise Profiles in Courage Award in Los Angeles in 2006. Please welcome Dr. Salim Mansur.
Thank you, shukran. Especially to Dr. George Gurgis, Lindsay Griffin, and of course Mother Gather Malek for inviting me to this weekend convention. For me, the first time I'm in a sort of an official or an organized setting, meeting my Coptic brothers and sisters, and it's a tremendous pleasure to be here and to share a few thoughts with you. I've been sitting and really enjoying so much of the discussion that has been going on this morning, and in particular, it was so delightful to hear young Coptic, especially the woman, the young lady, Marianne, if I remember her name, with so much of intelligence, passion, and enthusiasm that I had to corner her out there in the corridor and had a chat with her, and it was just a supreme pleasure. I mean, to have such young people in your community, in our community, with a vision that in so many different ways transcend the older generation, gives us the hope that they will do far better in representing what all of you are trying to do today in the years to come. So, I mean, this is something to be truly proud of, and you, as the parents of that generation, it is to you that all the merit goes. So thank you for doing what you're doing. So I will sort of step back. I mean, what I mean, you are quite necessarily and understandably occupied with the contemporary situation and the present needs and the present challenges that the Copts are faced with as a community in Egypt. And so your concerns are pretty much fixated with that, and that's quite correct, and that is what it is all about. But I want to, I mean, in the sense that I was invited, to take a step back and share with you thoughts which might not immediately be of concern to you, but I think put it in a larger framework of sort of a mutual engagement and a mutual understanding. So, we have seen, all of us, we have seen and recoiled from the horrific pictures of Coptic Christians beheaded by ISIS in 2015 in Libya. We have seen the repeated bombings of Coptic churches in Egypt over the past 2 decades and more. We have seen and read about the Maspero massacre in 2011, with the Egyptian military tanks deployed to protect peaceful Christian demonstrators, instead rolled over them, crushing many to defeat. We read reports of Coptic girls abducted, compelled to convert into Islam, and forced into marriages with Muslims. And we're not unaware of the increasingly deteriorating situation in terms of basic human rights of the Copts in Egypt. And we shudder, speak for myself, my family, my wife. By the way, my wife is from North Africa, and so she is an Arab, though I am not. And I've traveled in your part of the world extensively. So we shudder each time there is news of another act of hate-filled violence against the Copts or other religious minorities such as the Yazidis and the Fertile Crescent, Baha'is in Iran, Christians and Ahmadiyas in Pakistan, and ask ourselves, as Muslims, how do we account for these crimes against humanity perpetrated under the banner of Islam? How can I explain this? And apart from ritual condemnation of these demonstrable bigotry and violence, of appealing to governments in the West for assistance in ameliorating such unacceptable and intolerable situation, we honestly are at a loss for what needs to be done or can be done to hold the governments of Egypt and other Muslim majority states accountable for the failure to protect those vulnerable, as are the Copts, to organized violence by members of the majority population. And so in the limited time I have on hand, I will offer a few preliminary observations from my perspective as someone of Muslim origin, as I said, though I'm neither an Egyptian nor an Arab, in explaining how Egypt, and for that matter the worldwide Muslim ummah or community, arrived at this situation. I believe this is essential if we, Muslims and non-Muslims, in working together to find an exit out of this terrible situation, this impasse, for mutual survival, coexistence, and, God willing, a more promising future. It is sobering also to note that we have no alternative. And moreover, explaining a problem, as I'm setting out to do, is not an exercise in making excuses or engaging in apologetics or vilification of the other, as in recent time Muslims and non-Muslims have both engaged in doing, while the situation in which people suffer worsens. So at the outset, I wish to point out that we, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, belonging to the shared Semitic tradition of belief in the one God of Abraham, are not merely the progeny of Adam, we are also the children of Cain. In other words, we are stained with the blood of Abel that Cain shed in killing his sibling. Our history, despite differences, has this blood-stained past in commonality. And in acknowledging this, we might then hopefully find within us the remedy for our failings. We need always to keep in mind Jesus' admonishment to take the beam out of our eyes. And similarly, the warning in the Quran that God does not change the condition of a people unless they change what is in their hearts. So one, Egyptian Muslims are primarily and fundamentally responsible for the worsening situation of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. In constituting the overwhelming majority population of Egypt, Muslims have the primary, if not the sole, responsibility for securing the rights of the Copts as a religious minority, and are therefore accountable for the harm done to the Copts by any segment of the Muslim population in Egypt. Two, the systemic violence and incitement to violence directed by Egyptian Muslims against the Copts, especially those organized sectarian campaigns by Muslim Brotherhood and related groups, are crimes against humanity and should be treated as such by the international community. It is for Egyptian Muslims a heavier responsibility as part of the religious obligation to secure the well-being and protect the rights and dignity of the Copts of Egypt. For in persecuting Egypt's Muslims are grievously responsible for perverting Islam and shredding the directives of the Quran on protecting Jews and Christians as people of the book. God is the witness, and to God, as the Quran declares, each one of us will return and account for our deeds on the day of reckoning. It is not for God to forgive the wrong an individual does to another unless the wrongdoer has sought and received forgiveness from the victim. Egypt's Muslims, therefore, according to their own belief, are undeniably most guilty for the wrongs they have done to the Copts, and will most certainly be held accountable on the day of reckoning, when they will have nowhere to hide. 5. The tragedy of the Copts continues to worsen, and the wrong of Egypt's Muslims against the Copts are hugely amplified when we take into account the unique status of the Copts in the history of Islam. This was due to the very special and intimate relationship the leader of the Coptic Church was instrumental in arranging between his people and Prophet Muhammad. The following is a quotation I'm reading from the official history of the Coptic Church. For the 4 centuries that followed the Arab conquest of Egypt, the Coptic Church generally flourished and Egypt remained basically Christian. This is due to a large extent to the fortunate position that the Copts enjoyed, for Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, who had an Egyptian wife named Coptic Maria, preached special kindness towards Copts. Quote, "When you conquer Egypt, be kind to the Copts, for they are your protege and kith and kin," unquote. We know that as a few drops of lemons will curdle an entire bowl of milk, Egypt's Muslims, as Muslims elsewhere, have poured the whole Nile, made toxic by their bigotry, their violence, their culture degraded by authoritarianism, and an obstinacy to blame others for their own failing, into perverting Islam that they take for the final revelation as a matter of belief. 7. It is also undeniable that Egypt is embedded in world history, and consequently, This history has been shaped greatly by the cycle of invasions, conquest, exploitation by non-Egyptians, sectarian conflicts, and religious disputations turned violent. As Copts, you know that. You know what happened in Egypt after the Council of Chalcedon, when Egypt was not a Muslim country. Before the coming of the Arabs in the 7th century of the Common Era, and long after the Arabs had lost their supremacy in the region to non-Arabs and non-Muslims. The negative effects of such a long and enduring history also find expression in the violence that makes the Copts victims of Muslim bigotry and violence. 8. Muslims in general, including Egypt's Muslims, are third world people. And that will also include the Copts. And as a result, they're both victims and victimizers of a complicated history of our modern world. As third world people, they're confronted with the immense challenge of modernization, made even more difficult with outside powers deeply involved for both good and ill with their situation. Egypt's history bears the full imprint of this complicated history over the past century and more, since the failed 1882 uprising in the Nile Valley led by Ahmed Arabi. That failure led directly to the occupation of Egypt by Britain, and the unending struggle since to achieve both independence and development greatly distorted the inherent patience, kindness, nobility of the Egyptian people, as wars and the devastating consequences became a heavy burden on them. And finally, 9, it is easy to be magnanimous in victory, as Prophet Muhammad demonstrated, in particular as an example for Muslims following the conquest of Mecca in 630. But it is far easier to become embittered, resentful, and vengeful in defeat, as has been the history of Arabs and Muslims over the past century. This is when enlightened leadership becomes essential, but such leadership has been sorely missing in Egypt and in the wider Muslim world. So, what is to be done given the situation of Coptic Christians in Egypt and religious minorities across the Muslim Ummah? Whatever specific policy initiative is taken to deal with the situation, there is one indispensable requirement going forward. It is what Hans Küng, the great German Catholic theologian, declared recently, quote, "No survival without a world ethic, no peace, no world peace without peace between religions, no peace between the religions without dialogue between the religions." In other words, we are all interconnected, interdependent, and we need to remain engaged in conversation while remaining mindful, as Jesus said, of taking the beam out of our eyes. Those of us, Arab and non-Arabs, Muslims, engaged in the public square, have one simple and yet formidable task on hand, regardless of our capacity and available resources. This is to speak critically and unapologetically of the cultural sickness that pervades the Muslim Ummah and makes Muslims as a people intellectually retarded to understand how they have perverted God's word into a political ideology and turned the religion into a never-ending inquisition. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, and I've heard some criticism of him, so that is for the Egyptians to do. I'm an outsider, and I read and I listen, and I follow these discussions, so this is, from an outside perspective. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, when addressing in December 2014 the religious clerics of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the most renowned Sunni Muslim institution of learning in the world of Islam, declared unambiguously, "Honorable Imam," addressing the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, "Honorable Imam, you bear the responsibility before Allah. The world in its entirety awaits your words, because the Islamic nation is being torn apart. destroyed and is hurting to perdition. We ourselves are bringing it to perdition. President al-Sisi and others following his example need holding the mirror up for Muslim people to see how far removed they are from the ideals of their faith tradition, and that this is not a new situation. They need to know that when God's word does not penetrate into their hearts, as the Quran itself testifies against those Arabs of the desert who would not turn away from their pagan ways, and consequently, violence and tribalism became embedded in the earliest years following them in the practice of Islam. The violence against the Copts in our time is, for instance, indistinguishable from the tribal violence of the Arabs of the desert that destroyed the Prophet's immediate family soon after his demise. Other faith traditions were also burdened with similar history. The history of violence in Islam is not unique. But while Jews and Christians have dealt with violence in their history of their faith traditions and striven theologically to overcome their own respective malady, the situation of Muslims in the contemporary world is in most urgent need for similar theological remedy. Again, I will quote President al-Sisi at Al-Azhar. We must, this is President Sisi speaking, we must take a long, hard look at the current situation we are in. It is inconceivable that the ideology we sanctify should make our entire nation a source of concern, danger, killing, and destruction all over the world. It is inconceivable that this ideology, I'm referring not to religion, but to ideology, the body of ideas and texts that we have sanctified in the course of centuries, to the point that challenging them has become very difficult. In other words, the political leader in this case, al-Sisi, of present-day Egypt, understands that in perverting Islam, Muslim clerics, like the other Egyptian, Sheikh Qardawi, or the Iranian leader, the late Ayatollah Khomeini, they are responsible, have turned religion into ideology, and this has to be remedied theologically. The question is whether the religious leaders of Egypt understand the matter or no, and if they do, then will they have the integrity to meet the challenge President Sisi has identified? And finally, the Western powers also have the responsibility they cannot neglect if they are to maintain credibility regarding their politics as appropriately based on the ethics of human rights. It is very easy to mouth human rights as Western leaders do, but their record is one long, unmitigated disaster. Their reputation is at best, when it comes to the Middle East and the Muslim world, it's a mixed record, given the past record of the relationship with Muslims. Muslims in Egypt and elsewhere know from their experience the extent to which the Western powers have betrayed in practice what they pronounce in theory when it comes to human rights, democratic principles, and support for people under authoritarian regimes. I don't have to point out to you the 30 years of Mubarak regime. And the same case is true in Indonesia with the Suharto regime, or in Pakistan with the military dictatorship, etc., etc., etc. So we are all children of Cain. Let us not forget that. Egypt has a long record of Muslims engaged in the struggle to modernize their society. Names of Muslim reformers from within the ranks of religious leaders, such as Muhammad Abdu and Ali Abdul Razak, and secular leaders such as Taha Hussein and Hassan Hanafi, are very well known. Their failure to lead Egypt out of the cultural backwardness of the third world societies was compounded by the Western powers to those who ruled ruthlessly in pursuing their own interests at the expense of the needs of the people. Egypt, like other Muslim countries, was also caught in the crossfire of the world wars waged by the great powers during the last century and the subsequent Cold War confrontation between the two military blocs of the East and the West. As a result of this history, developments in Egypt became greatly distorted by the role of outside powers in cultivating those people within Egypt, directly or indirectly, who were opposed to modern liberal values of science and democracy under the false banner of Islam. Indeed, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood is ideologically committed to wage jihad against infidels and violence against the Copts. Those individuals who founded the Brotherhood, including Hassan al-Banna, were influenced by the ideas and organizing principles of fascists and communists in Europe between the two world wars. Moreover, the first example of ISIS as an Arab-Muslim version of fascism in action was the making of Saudi Arabia, in which both Britain and the United States were heavily invested. These are part of the historical records, and I'm not getting into polemics, simply historical record of the 20th century, and Muslims have paid dearly for such misguided intervention by Western powers in the Middle East and elsewhere in Muslim countries such as Pakistan and Indonesia. The Cold War is long over, and we are well into the 21st century. What is long overdue from the West is a robust policy to defend and secure human rights for everyone, especially the minorities in Muslim majority countries. The West, however, does not need to invent a new set of policies, since it has on hand well-tested policies of both defending and successfully advancing respect for human rights within totalitarian states of the former Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. I'm referring here to the Helsinki Agreement of 1975, which in retrospect contributed to the undoing of communism in the Soviet Union and its satellites in Eastern Europe. A similar policy modeled on the Helsinki Agreement and tailored to the specific situation within the Muslim world, as in Egypt, by the Western powers, led by the United States, should be presented as a sine qua non to the member states of the Organization of Islamic Countries if they wish to maintain a relationship of mutual respect and assistance with, for instance, the G7 nations. The OIC member states, including Egypt, must know in no uncertain terms, as signatories of the UN-adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, that their complicity in the abuse of human rights or failure in preventing them will have serious consequences and will not be tolerated. The Western powers must also make it known categorically that the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam of August 1990, adopted by the OIC, is unacceptable, since it states, according to Article 24 of the document, Sharia supremacy as a lawful basis for rights and freedom. In other words, according to the Cairo Declaration of 1990, if there is difference in meaning and in practice between the Universal Declaration and the Cairo Declaration, then the latter will prevail over the former. This Sharia exceptionalism, when it comes to human rights, should be totally unacceptable to the Western powers. And especially to the United States as a principal founding member of the United Nations, as it is unacceptable to Muslims who understand the incompatibility of Sharia with the requirements of the modern world. Since It is an obsolete product of the minds of men belonging in the early Middle Ages. The Copts, for instance, are daily made victims on the basis of Sharia in Egypt, and there is no reprieve for them from Sharia-based bigotry and violence so long the Egyptian government and society continue to insist on imposing Sharia-directed rule and regulation within Egypt. We should not only urge but demand incessantly until met that the United States lead the G7 to adopt a Helsinki-type agreement in the dealings with the member states of the OIC. I think with your efforts as Americans, if you can reach President Trump, I think he will be, in so many different ways, sensitive to this issue and to this call. Such an agreement will most definitely have an effect over time in improving the condition of human rights within the Muslim world, in protecting religious minorities, in securing equal status for women, in defending free speech as essential for advancing democracy, as it did in liberating the people under communism in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. So it is a tried and proven set of policy. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to take it out and implement it. In conclusion, the treatment of the Copts in Egypt is an inexcusable moral outrage for any thinking Muslim aware of the religious tradition bequeathed to him by his prophet. This tradition includes the affection of the prophet for the Copts through his marriage with Maria, a daughter of the Copts, who bore him the son, Ibrahim, he so earnestly desired. The Copts, as a result of this providentially blessed relationship, which the Coptic Church recognizes, as I said, read to you from the history of the Coptic Church, became, as a people, an extended family of the prophet, his kith and kin, as recorded by the Coptic Church. When Egyptian Muslims seek God's mercy, Ramadan just ended, they bang their head 5 times a day seeking God's mercy. They need reminding that it begins with seeking forgiveness of the Copts and making atonement for the wrongs they have done them. Shukran, my brothers and sisters.